He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but in less than 5 minutes, the entire room would forget his name and remember hers instead. The chandeliers above the grand midtown chess hall cast a golden glow over polished marble floors as cameras lined the perimeter, capturing every angle of Ethan Blake, America's reigning chess grandmaster. A man known not just for his brilliance, but for the quiet arrogance that followed him like a shadow. And tonight was supposed to be another effortless display of dominance. Another exhibition match where he dismantled challengers with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. But then there was Clara Whitmore, standing near the back wall in a simple gray cardigan, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she watched without expression. Just another staff member to everyone else. Someone who blended into the background so completely that even the security guard had nearly asked her to step aside earlier, and yet Ethan had noticed her, not because she stood out, but because she didn't, because in a room filled with tailored suits and polished shoes, her quiet stillness felt almost out of place, and that was exactly the kind of thing he liked to turn into a spectacle. "You there," he called out suddenly, his voice echoing through the hall as conversations stopped mid-sentence, dozens of heads turning in unison. "Why don't you come up here and give us a game?" A ripple of laughter spread instantly, light at first, then sharper as people realized he was serious. Clara hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, her eyes lifting to meet his across the room. And in that brief moment, something flickered there, something too steady to be fear, but it passed so quickly no one noticed, not even Ethan, who gestured impatiently toward the stage as if inviting a volunteer at a party. "Don't worry," he added with a smirk. "I'll go easy on you." The audience chuckled again, phones already rising, live streams beginning. Comments flooding in from viewers miles away who had no idea they were about to witness something that would be replayed over and over again. Clara stepped forward slowly, her shoes barely making a sound, against the marble as she moved through the crowd, and with every step, the contrast became more obvious. Her simple clothes against the sharp lines of tailored jackets, her calm expression against the amused anticipation around her, until she reached the table and sat down across from him. The chessboard between them gleaming under the lights. Ethan leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as if this were already over. "Do you even know how the pieces move?" he asked casually, loud enough for the front rows to hear. More laughter, more whispers, but Clara didn't respond right away. She simply looked at the board, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Then she reached out, her fingers hovering over the pieces with a familiarity that felt almost invisible, like a habit long buried beneath years of silence. And that was the moment everything began to shift. Though no one understood it yet, not the audience, not the cameras, and certainly not Ethan Blake, who was still smiling as if he had already won, because he had no idea that the quiet woman sitting across from him had just stepped into a game she had never truly left, and that the first move she was about to make would not just challenge him, it would unravel everything he thought he knew about control, about mastery, about who belonged at the table, and in the stillness before her hand touched the board, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the room was bracing for something it couldn't yet name. Clara's fingers finally settled on a single pawn, and without hesitation she advanced it 2 squares forward, a simple opening move that should have meant nothing. Yet the precision in her timing made Ethan's eyes narrow ever so slightly, not in concern, but in curiosity, because something about the way she moved did not match the uncertainty he expected. The crowd barely reacted at first, a few scattered chuckles continuing as if the performance was still amusing, but the retired champion, seated in the 3rd row, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression sharpening as he watched the board more closely. Ethan responded quickly, almost automatically, his own pawn meeting hers in the center, the kind of textbook reply he could make in his sleep. "Good start," he said lightly, his tone still playful, still dismissive. But Clara did not look at him. She only watched the board, her eyes steady, absorbing every detail as if the noise around them had faded into nothing. And then she made her second move, a knight developing in a line that was not incorrect, but unusual. For someone untrained, it was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, yet it caused a flicker of hesitation in Ethan's posture, his fingers pausing midair before completing his next move. A small break in rhythm that only a trained eye would notice. The murmurs in the room softened, not gone, but less confident now. As if the joke had lost a fraction of its certainty, cameras zoomed in, capturing the board, the players, the growing stillness between them. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his earlier ease replaced with a more attentive focus. Not because he felt threatened, not yet, but because something about this pattern was beginning to feel deliberate. Clara's third move came without delay, a bishop sliding into position, creating a line of pressure that was easy to overlook but difficult to ignore once seen. And that was when the retired champion in the audience exhaled quietly, almost a whisper. "That is not random," he said to no one in particular, his voice barely audible, yet the weight of it seemed to ripple outward. Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to betray a shift in his thinking. He adjusted his position again, this time taking a few seconds longer, analyzing, recalibrating, and when he finally made his move, it was no longer casual. It was calculated, careful, and for the first time since the match began, the room felt different. The laughter had faded, replaced by a cautious silence that crept in slowly, like a realization forming at the edge of awareness. Clara remained composed, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, but there was a quiet intensity in her gaze now, something that had not been there before, or perhaps something that had always been there and simply gone unnoticed. She reached for another piece, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she had played this position countless times before, and when she placed it down, the board transformed in an instant, lines converging, threats emerging, possibilities collapsing into a single undeniable truth that only a few in the room could fully grasp. Ethan saw it, and for a fraction of a second, his expression froze. Not dramatically, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for those watching closely to understand that something had shifted beyond control. The advantage he assumed was his had begun to slip, not suddenly, but inevitably, like a tide turning beneath the surface. And as the silence deepened, as the air grew heavier with unspoken recognition, Clara lifted her eyes for the first time and met his gaze, calm, unwavering. And in that moment, the game was no longer a performance. It was something else entirely, something that could not be undone, something that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The shift did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in the quiet tightening of Ethan's shoulders, in the way his fingers hovered just a fraction longer above each piece before committing. Because now he was no longer playing for entertainment. He was calculating, recalculating, searching for the flaw that had to exist. Because in his world, there was always a flaw in an amateur's play. Always a moment where inexperience revealed itself. But as he scanned the board again, that moment refused to appear. Clara's structure held together with a calm, almost invisible logic. Each piece placed not just correctly, but purposefully. And the longer he looked, the more he realized that every option he considered had already been anticipated. The realization did not strike all at once. It crept in slowly, like a thought he did not want to acknowledge. The audience felt it too, though they could not yet name it. The earlier amusement had dissolved completely, replaced by a stillness that spread row by row. Even the soft hum of whispered commentary from the live stream booth had quieted, as if the commentators themselves were uncertain how to explain what they were seeing. Clara moved again, her hand steady, guiding a rook into position that seemed harmless at first glance. But then Ethan saw it, the alignment, the pressure building along a file he had momentarily neglected. His eyes narrowed, his mind racing through variations, 10 moves ahead, 15, searching for an escape that did not compromise something else. Because every path he followed seemed to lead back to the same conclusion, a tightening net, invisible to anyone who did not understand the depth of it, but undeniable once seen. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, a subtle gesture that only those closest to him would recognize as concentration under strain. And for the first time that evening, he did not speak. No witty remark, no casual comment, just silence, heavy and deliberate. Clara remained unchanged, her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed on the board, as if the growing tension in the room existed somewhere far away. And yet there was something else now, something beneath the calm, a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself, a confidence that came not from proving something, but from already knowing. The retired champion in the third row shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving the board. "He is already behind," he murmured softly, the words barely audible, but those nearest to him stiffened at the implication, because if that was true, then everything they thought this match was supposed to be had already collapsed. Ethan made his move at last, a defensive adjustment, precise, careful, but reactive, no longer dictating the pace, and the moment his hand left the piece, Clara responded almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for that exact decision. Her move was not rushed, but it carried a finality that settled over the board like a shadow, and that was when the realization began to spread beyond the experts, beyond the few who understood the structure, into the wider audience, because even without knowing the intricacies, they could feel the imbalance, the shift in control, the way Ethan's confidence had given way to something quieter, something uncertain. The cameras caught his expression more closely now, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set as he leaned forward again, studying, searching, but finding less with each passing second. Clara finally looked up once more, not at the crowd, not at the cameras, but directly at him, her eyes steady, unblinking, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, not of victory, not yet, but of truth, and in that moment, Ethan understood something he had not expected to face that night. He was no longer in control of the game, and the room, once filled with laughter, now held only a quiet, growing awareness that they were witnessing something far different from what they had come to see. By now, the silence in the grand midtown chess hall was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, deliberate, as if every person in the room had subconsciously agreed that speaking would break something fragile and extraordinary unfolding before them. Ethan Blake leaned closer to the board, his world narrowing to 64 squares that no longer obeyed him the way they always had, because every calculation he ran seemed to collapse into the same unsettling conclusion. Clara Whitmore was not reacting. She was leading, and not just leading, but guiding the game with a precision that felt almost pre-written, as though each of his decisions had already been accounted for long before he sat down. His fingers moved toward his queen, paused, then shifted instead to a knight, adjusting, searching for complexity, for imbalance, for any path that might disrupt her control. But even that decision carried hesitation, a subtle fracture in the confidence that had defined him for years. The audience saw it. Now, not in technical terms, but in the way his movements had slowed. In the absence of that effortless rhythm he once displayed, whispers did not return. Instead, there was only the faint sound of fabric shifting, a quiet breath here and there, the almost imperceptible creak of a chair as someone leaned forward to see more clearly. Clara responded without delay, her hand moving with calm certainty as she repositioned her bishop. And in that instant, the board transformed again, lines intersecting with quiet inevitability, pressure tightening in a way that was not dramatic but suffocating. Ethan's eyes widened just slightly as he recognized the pattern forming, a structure he had studied years ago, one that demanded exact precision to survive. And yet here it was, executed not with the aggressive flourish of a grandmaster seeking applause, but with the quiet restraint of someone who understood that control did not need to be loud. The retired champion in the third row exhaled again, slower this time, his expression no longer curious but certain. "She is not just good," he whispered, almost to himself. "She is controlling every square that matters." And that was when the realization spread fully through the room, not as a sudden shock, but as a dawning truth that settled into every corner of the hall. Ethan was being outplayed, not by chance, not by a lucky sequence, but by design. Clara's eyes never left the board, but there was a subtle shift in her presence now, something steady, grounded, as if she had stepped into a space that belonged to her long before this night. Her next move came with the same quiet precision, a rook sliding into alignment, reinforcing a structure that now left Ethan with fewer options than he could remember having in any public match. He leaned back again, this time more noticeably, his hand brushing lightly against his chin as he tried to reconstruct the position in his mind, searching for a resource, a tactic. anything that could break the tightening grip around his position. But the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that every path led to concession, not immediate, not obvious to the untrained eye, but inevitable, like a clock ticking down without sound. The cameras captured his face from every angle now, the slight tension in his jaw, the focus in his eyes, the absence of that earlier arrogance, and across from him, Clara remained composed, almost still, her breathing steady, her gaze unwavering. And for a brief moment, the entire hall seemed to exist in that contrast. One man searching for control he no longer had, one woman holding it without needing to prove it, and then, as if guided by something deeper than calculation, Clara reached forward once more, her fingers resting lightly on a single piece before moving it into place. And in that moment, the board did not just change, it clarified, every line, every threat, every consequence becoming visible in a way that could no longer be ignored. Ethan saw it, the audience felt it, and somewhere in the room, a quiet realization settled like a final note. This was no longer a match he could recover from. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, and it was only getting closer to its inevitable end. There is a moment in every game where the outcome is no longer a question of possibility, but of acceptance. And as Ethan Blake stared at the board in front of him, that moment had already arrived. Even if he had not yet admitted it to himself, the pieces were no longer just arranged in patterns. They told a story now, a story of control slowly taken and never returned. Clara Whitmore sat across from him, unchanged, her posture calm, her expression neutral, but there was something undeniable in the air between them, something that every person in that silent hall could feel. Ethan reached forward again, his fingers selecting a move that was technically sound, a final attempt to create complexity, to open a path where none seemed to exist. And for a brief second, a few in the audience leaned in, wondering if this was the turning point, if the grandmaster had finally found a way to shift the balance back in his favor. But Clara responded almost immediately, her piece sliding into place with quiet certainty. And in that instant, the illusion collapsed, because her move did not just answer his. It closed everything, every escape, every hidden line, every last fragment of hope that had remained on the board. Ethan froze, his hand hovering slightly above the table as his eyes traced the position again and again, searching for something he had missed, something impossible to miss. And yet there was nothing, only the same unavoidable conclusion repeating itself with each calculation. The room felt even smaller now, the silence deeper, heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness what came next. The retired champion in the third row slowly shook his head, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because he had seen this kind of precision before, not often, not in years, but enough to understand exactly what it meant. Clara did not rush. She did not speak. She simply waited, her gaze resting on the board, giving Ethan the time he needed to arrive at the truth on his own. And that was when it happened, not with a dramatic gesture, not with a sudden movement, but with a quiet stillness as Ethan leaned back in his chair, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his expression shifting from resistance to realization. He looked at the board one final time, then at Clara, really looked at her now, not as a curiosity, not as a participant in a performance, but as an equal, and perhaps something more, someone who had stepped into his world and reshaped it in front of everyone without raising her voice or demanding attention. The cameras captured every detail, the stillness, the tension, the unspoken understanding that had settled between them. And then, with a small, deliberate motion, Ethan reached forward and gently tipped his king, the gesture simple, almost understated, but unmistakable in its meaning, a quiet acknowledgement of defeat that echoed louder than any applause could have. For a moment, nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just a suspended silence that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. And then the room exhaled, not in chaos, not in noise, but in a wave of stunned realization, because what they had witnessed was not just an upset, not just a surprising outcome. It was something far more rare, something that could not be staged or predicted. Clara Whitmore slowly lifted her eyes from the board, her expression unchanged, as if this outcome had always been the only one that mattered. And somewhere in that quiet, as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. One question began to form in every mind, the same question that no one had thought to ask before. Who exactly was the woman they had just watched defeat a grandmaster as if she had known the ending all along? The sound did not come all at once. It returned in fragments, a chair shifting, a breath released, the faint rustle of movement as people began to process what they had just witnessed, but no one spoke immediately, because words felt too small for what had just unfolded on that board. Ethan Blake kept his hand resting near the fallen king for a moment longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in the reality of it, then slowly withdrew, his posture no longer carrying the effortless confidence from before, but something quieter, something more measured. He looked at Clara Whitmore again, not with disbelief, but with a kind of recognition that had not been there at the start. That was not luck, he said finally, his voice calm, steady, carrying through the hall without force. And even in those few words, there was an admission that everyone understood. Clara did not respond right away. She simply adjusted the pieces slightly, returning them to a neutral position as if the game had been nothing more than a brief exercise. Her movements precise, unhurried, and that calmness seemed to ripple outward, grounding the moment in something real, something undeniable. The cameras continued to capture everything. The close angles on Ethan's face, the wider shots of the audience still frozen in quiet awe, and somewhere near the front, the retired champion stood slowly, his eyes fixed on Clara with a certainty that had replaced all earlier curiosity. "I have seen that pattern before," he said, his voice firm now, carrying across the room, "but not in many years." The statement landed heavily, drawing attention not just from the audience, but from Ethan himself, who turned slightly toward the man, his brow tightening as if searching through memory. Clara paused for the briefest moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, and though she did not look up immediately, something in her stillness suggested that she understood exactly what was being implied. The room leaned into that silence again, waiting, not for another move on the board, but for something deeper, something that would explain what they had just seen. Ethan spoke again, more carefully this time. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, not as a challenge, but as a genuine need to understand. Clara finally lifted her gaze, meeting his with the same steady calm that had defined her from the beginning. "A long time ago," she replied softly, her voice quiet but clear, and for a moment, that seemed like all she intended to say. But the retired champion took a step closer, his expression sharpening with recognition. "Clara Whitmore," he said slowly, as if confirming something that had been forming in his mind. "You were the one who disappeared." A ripple moved through the audience, subtle but undeniable, as a few people exchanged glances, unsure but intrigued. Ethan's eyes shifted back to Clara, the name settling into place with growing significance, because somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a memory, a story, a prodigy who had risen quickly and then vanished without explanation, and now that story was no longer distant. It was sitting across from him, calm, composed, as if none of it required acknowledgement. Clara did not confirm it directly. She did not deny it either. She simply returned her attention to the board, aligning the final piece with quiet precision. And in that simple action, there was a message clearer than any explanation. She had never needed the room to know who she was. The game had already said everything. And as the weight of that realization settled over the hall, the silence returned once more, not empty this time, but full, filled with understanding, with respect, with the quiet recognition that what they had witnessed was not just a victory, but the reemergence of something that had never truly been gone. And in that moment, even Ethan Blake understood that the lesson had never been about the game itself. It had been about the assumption that mastery always announces itself, when sometimes it simply waits, unnoticed, until the right moment to be seen. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the moment it was spoken, it settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything. Clara Whitmore, a name that some recognized instantly, and others only half remembered, but all felt the significance of as the silence deepened once more. Ethan Blake remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on her as if reassembling a memory piece by piece. And then it clicked, not just the name, but the reputation that had once surrounded it. a prodigy who had dominated junior circuits, who had been described as years ahead of her time, who had disappeared just as quickly as she rose, leaving behind questions no one had ever answered. And now she was here, not on a stage as a champion, not behind a title or recognition, but standing quietly, in a simple cardigan, as if the years between had never demanded acknowledgement. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing into something more grounded, more human. "I remember now," he said, his voice quieter, stripped of the earlier performance. "They said you would change the game." There was no sarcasm in his words, only a realization that came too late to prevent what had already happened. Clara did not respond immediately, her eyes lowering briefly to the board as if the conversation existed somewhere outside the space she occupied. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried no pride, no need to reclaim anything that had been said about her. "People say a lot of things," she replied, simple, almost dismissive, and yet there was something in that simplicity that spoke louder than any declaration could have. The audience shifted again, not with noise, but with a collective adjustment in perspective, because the story they thought they were watching had already unraveled, replaced by something far more layered, far more real. The retired champion stepped closer now, his presence steady, respectful. "You walked away," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Clara nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible. "Yes," she answered, and left it there. No explanation, no elaboration, as if the reasons behind that choice belonged to a time that no longer required revisiting. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then glanced down at the board, at the position that had once seemed so clear and now felt like a lesson written in silence. "Why come back like this?" he asked, the question quiet, genuine, carrying none of the arrogance that had marked the beginning of the night. Clara's gaze lifted again, meeting his with the same steady calm. "I did not come back," she said, and there was a subtle shift in the air as those words settled. "I was already here." The meaning lingered, unfolding slowly, not just for Ethan, but for everyone listening, because it reframed everything they had assumed. She had not returned to reclaim anything. She had not stepped forward to prove a point. She had simply existed in the same space, unnoticed, until someone decided to turn her into a spectacle, and in doing so, revealed something far greater than they intended. The room absorbed that realization in silence, the weight of it pressing gently but firmly against every earlier judgment, every quiet dismissal that had passed without thought. Ethan nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because the truth of it was undeniable. He had not discovered her, he had exposed his own assumptions, and now he was left to stand in front of them without the shield of certainty he had carried for so long. Clara stepped back from the table then, her hands resting briefly at her sides, her presence still calm, still grounded, as if the moment had already passed for her. Even as it continued to ripple outward for everyone else, the cameras remained fixed, capturing every second, but the energy had changed, no longer focused on spectacle, but on something quieter, something that demanded reflection rather than reaction. And as Clara turned slightly, preparing to step away from the board, the room did not stop her. No one called out, no one interrupted, because there was an unspoken understanding now that what had needed to be seen had already been revealed, and it did not require anything more. No one stopped her, but no one looked away either, because the moment Clara Whitmore turned from the board, something shifted again, not in her, but in the room itself, as if every person present understood that what had just happened did not end with the final move. It lingered, pressing against their thoughts, reshaping the way they saw everything that came before it. Ethan Blake remained seated for a second longer, his eyes following her as she stepped away from the table, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. And for the first time that evening, he stood not as the center of attention, but as someone catching up to a moment that had already moved beyond him. "Clara," he said, not loudly, but enough to stop her just short of the edge of the stage. She paused, not turning immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to give weight to his words. When she finally looked back, her expression remained unchanged, calm, steady, as if she had expected nothing more from the night than what had already unfolded. Ethan stepped forward, closing the space between them, not as a challenger, but as someone who had something to acknowledge. "I misjudged you," he said plainly. No performance, no deflection, just the truth laid out without decoration. And in a room where he had spent years building a reputation on certainty, that simple admission carried more impact than anything he had said before. The audience felt it, the shift from arrogance to humility, from control to understanding. Clara held his gaze for a moment, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a quiet acceptance that seemed to recognize the weight of what he had just done. "You did not see me," she replied softly, her voice even, not accusatory, but precise. And those words settled into the space between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, because he knew it was true. It had never been about her actions, her moves, or her presence. It had been about his assumption that someone like her did not belong in that space. And now that assumption had been dismantled in front of everyone. The retired champion stepped forward as well, his expression carrying a deep respect that needed no exaggeration. "There are players who learn the game," he said, his voice steady. "And there are players who understand it." He paused briefly, letting the distinction settle. "You never stopped understanding." Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without embracing them, because she did not need validation, not from him, not from anyone. The truth of what she was had already been revealed in the only way that mattered to her. The board, the game, the quiet execution of something that required no explanation. The cameras continued to capture everything. But the energy had changed again, no longer focused on the spectacle of an upset, but on something far more lasting. A realization that would follow each person long after they left that hall. Ethan glanced back at the board one final time. The pieces now reset, neutral, as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. He turned back to Clara, his voice quieter now. "Will you play again?" It was not a demand, not even a request in the usual sense, but something closer to an invitation shaped by respect rather than ego. Clara looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady, considering not the question itself, but what it represented. Then she gave the smallest shake of her head, not dismissive, not final, just honest. "I already did," she said. And with that, she turned again, stepping away from the stage, leaving behind a room that would not forget what it had witnessed, not because of the outcome, but because of the lesson it carried, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, one that had already settled into the silence that followed her as she walked. And in that silence, the world around Ethan Blake felt just a little different than it had before. The doors of the grand Midtown Chess Hall did not close immediately, yet no one rushed to leave, because something in the air refused to let the moment end so easily. Conversations began in low tones, not the excited chatter of a spectacle, but the measured voices of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed, replaying each move in their minds, not as a game, but as a revelation. Ethan Blake remained near the board, no longer surrounded by the same energy that once followed him, but not diminished either, simply changed, as if the space around him had expanded in a way that forced him to see beyond himself. He looked once more toward the direction Clara Whitmore had walked, though she was no longer visible. Her presence lingered in the quiet structure of the room, in the memory of each calculated move, in the silence she had left behind. The retired champion stood beside him now, hands clasped loosely, eyes still reflecting the depth of what had unfolded. "Moments like that," he said softly. "They do not happen often." Ethan nodded, not out of agreement, but out of recognition, because he understood now that what he had experienced was not a loss in the traditional sense. It was something far more instructive, far more enduring, a shift that would stay with him long after the board was cleared. The cameras slowly powered down, the bright lights dimming just enough to return the hall to something closer to its original state. But even as the physical setting returned to normal, the atmosphere did not. It held onto the weight of what had been revealed, as if the lesson itself had taken shape within the space. People began to move again, but with a subtle difference, their steps quieter, their expressions more thoughtful. Some glanced back at the table, at the simple arrangement of pieces that now looked almost ordinary, and yet carried a meaning far beyond their form. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware that inside those walls, something fundamental had shifted in the way a room full of people understood presence, value, and assumption. Ethan finally stepped away from the board, his posture straight, but no longer defined by certainty alone. He carried something new now, something quieter, something earned not through victory, but through understanding. And as he walked toward the exit, he paused briefly, just once, as if considering the path that had led him there, not just that evening, but every decision that had shaped the way he saw the world. And in that pause, there was no regret, only clarity. Clara Whitmore did not reappear. She did not return for acknowledgement or recognition, because she never needed to. Her absence spoke just as clearly as her presence had, a reminder that true mastery does not seek attention. It simply exists, waiting, unnoticed until the moment demands it. And as the last of the audience filtered out, carrying with them the quiet imprint of